Glen Judge Carberry was the captain of the 1922 Fighting Irish football team under Knute Rockne. He was a big, hard-hitting end who was at Notre Dame in the halcyon days of George Gipp to the beginning of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. But possibly no one had as interesting a journey getting to Notre Dame against the headwinds and achieving greatness as Glen Carberry. It took him from the fields of Iowa to being wounded on the battlefields of France in the Great War. This is the story of his journey and how his incredible family helped steer the way. Glen Michael Carberry was born in Panora, Iowa in 1896, one of 13 children of J.H. and Molly Walsh Carberry. Molly and J.H. were Irish Catholics who embraced the American dream. At the turn of the century, they saw how the pastime of football engaged their older sons and interested the younger ones. The oldest child, William, played in the Guthrie County leagues as the high schools were not fielding teams. He graduated, and Molly and J.H. sent him to the State University of Iowa and encouraged him to play football. He became a star at Iowa as an end, punter, and punt returner. 4 years later, Joseph Leo, the next oldest brother, followed Bill to the University of Iowa, where he was also a star end, punter, and punt returner. Next up was Glen, 6 years behind Joe and 11 years behind Bill. A high school freshman in 1912, Guthrie County schools still did not have solid programs, so Molly and J.H. sent Glen to live with sister Gertie and her husband Paul Taff in Ames. Ames was a bigger town with a vibrant high school sports program. With hard work and great coaching, Glen became a football star in Ames. And just like his brothers, he played end. After 3 years, everyone in Ames thought Glen would play at the local college, Iowa State, then called the Agricultural and Mechanical College. But Molly and J.H. had been writing letters, telling of Glen's abilities to Iowa's federal congressmen, and their efforts paid off. Iowa Senator Albert Cummins got Glen an appointment at the West Point Military Academy in New York. It would be a memorable year for West Point football. The varsity team went 9-0, beating arch-rival Notre Dame 30-10. As a plebe, Glen practiced with the freshmen, and his strong play was noticed. But after 7 months of classes, in January of 1917, West Point advised Glen, due to deficiencies in math, he would have to leave the academy, ending his West Point career. Glen returned to Gertie and Paul Taff's in Ames and enrolled at the Iowa State College. It was a tumultuous time, and during his classes, war was declared. Glen went to nearby Camp Dodge, Iowa, and enlisted in the United States Army on September 4th, 1917. Camp Dodge mustered in thousands of men from all over the country, and they also had a football team. Glen joined the 88th Divisional football team at Camp Dodge and practiced and played games in 1917 versus colleges such as Nebraska and Drake. The Great War intensified, and wanting to see action, he volunteered for the 804th Pioneer Regiment at Camp Dodge. This was a colored regiment that needed commissioned officers, and they were being sent straight to the war for combat engineer needs. They deployed together, sailing to France in September of 1918. Back at Camp Dodge, 3 weeks after Glen left, the deadly Spanish flu hit on October 1st, 1918, and 700 soldiers died. Glen's volunteering may have saved his life. Lieutenant Carberry's Company K disabled mines and munitions with the 2nd Army. At one point during ordnance disposal with his battalion, a huge ammo dump exploded, injuring many, including Lieutenant Carberry, who was hospitalized for 3 weeks with injuries. A permanent injury was a ruptured eardrum, and he was never able to hear again out of his left ear. Glen sailed to New York with his regiment on the USS Philippine, arriving in New York in August. That same month, the entire Carberry family had moved to Ames to give all of the children opportunities like Glen had had. Glen, fresh from the war, joined the family at the big, sprawling house. Molly was excited to give him the news. Her nephew, Glen's first cousin, Earl Walsh of nearby Adair, Iowa, was in the starting backfield of Notre Dame, and he had told Knute Rockne about Glen, and he had heard that Rockne wanted him at Notre Dame. Glen appreciated Earl putting the word in for him, and Glen had also heard from various channels. He decided to try to make possibly the best team in the world, and he hoped he'd be up for this challenge. It was said on the train platform the day Glen left for South Bend, Molly put a rosary in his hand and said, "For he knows the plans he has for you, plans to prosper and not be harmed." And Glen squeezed his mother's hand and was gone.
And when I explain something to one man that's playing the same position you are, listen and see what it is. So I won't have to waste all that time going and telling the same thing over dozens and dozens of times.
Take it in. Oh, that's good. Lay on. Good. 54, 29, 87. Heap 1, 2, 1.
Hit the answer,
2,
Foley.
3. Heap 1.
Hit that answer, Foley.
7.
Football had been Glen's life, but he realized this was not the pastures of Guthrie County. He was 24 years old. Rockne had an organized and complicated offense and defense. Rockne had also taken a long road to football. He'd worked 4 years in a Chicago post office to get the money to attend Notre Dame. His favorite sport was track, but with Notre Dame, he became famous as a football All-American at end. He knew this World War I vet law school student would be going against two of his very best ends, and two of the best ends in the game, Eddie Anderson and Roger Kiley. Anderson, another Iowan, had a coach's mind, could catch and block. Kiley had a killer instinct, caught every pass like a baseball, and broke free for big gains in nearly every game. Knute knew what Carberry might be thinking. It was a daunting team and tough competition, but he wanted to welcome him, but also let him know he had to work. Early in one of the practices, Glen subbed for Kiley and promptly dropped a pass. "Carberry!" Rockne yelled. "Keep playing like that and you'll spend more time on the bench than any judge in history." Judge became Glen's nickname from that day on. Judge Carberry earned a coveted spot on the 1920 team, a team that became legendary. Called a back alley brawl by the New York Times, every major news organization was present. George Gipp was a standout, and the Irish came from behind, winning 24-17. Gipp ran straight up with finesse and abandon. To quote the papers, he was spectacular at all times, especially during someone's Marquess of Queensberry's maneuver removed his headgear, but he kept going. Judge Carberry was noticed in this battle.
N-O-T-R-E-G-A-M-E. Notre Dame! Notre
The 1920 Notre Dame team ended the season undefeated at 10-0. They were voted retroactively the national champions, but the season ended in tragedy when Gipp, consensus All-American first team, died of pneumonia. The funeral procession leaving the chapel at Notre Dame included the war veteran Carberry and all Gipp's teammates. The 1920 photo was taken after Gipp died, with Rock instructing a place be made. They added George to the photo later. Knute, with a degree in pharmacy, had created a prescription for winning at Notre Dame, and few fans felt anyone would stop them in 1921. Mohardt at quarterback, Eddie Anderson was captain, Hunk Anderson the powerful lineman, and a backup of stars like Judge. They took a 22-game winning streak into Iowa City, Iowa. It was the game of the century for Iowans and a milestone for Glen. He and cousin Earl Walsh plus Anderson were coming back to their home state to play. Rockne, looking for an edge, felt the Hawkeyes' black jerseys were too close in color to his navy. This game was the first they ever wore green. Glen's family would be at the game, including the two older brothers, who were stars for the Hawkeyes. It was rumored Molly and J.H. said, "We are cheering for Iowa, but praying for Notre Dame." The old Iowa field by the river was filled to the brim. Iowa had quarterback Aubrey Devine of Des Moines West High School, a fast end-around runner with precision passing and a tremendous player on defense. Another star was the helmetless tackle from the Mississippi River town of Clinton, Iowa, Duke Slater. As a youngster, his dad said, "I will buy you a helmet or cleats, but not both." Duke took the cleats and never looked back. Glen was anxious to play, but had been injured the game before. Iowa got behind early. Glen went in, and knowing he was injured, Iowa sent 3 running plays his way, but he stuck every runner for a loss. However, Aubrey Devine intercepted a 3rd down pass in the end zone. The pivotal moment of the game was a key down when Duke Slater took out 3 Notre Dame players on 1 block, opening the way for fullback Gordon Locke out of Denison, Iowa. Iowa won 10-7. The play was immortalized in bronze in Iowa City. The Hawkeyes went on to win the mythical national championship of 1921. The Irish went on to win the rest of their games, including Purdue, Nebraska, and Army. Glen played great football through it all. The team with their 8-0-1 record in 1922 into the final game of his career at the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and they had lost to Glen and Notre Dame the last 2 meetings. Glen broke his hand in the game but kept playing without complaint. At halftime, the Cornhuskers' dying equipment manager was brought in on a stretcher and from his deathbed encouraged the Husker lads to beat the Catholics. Nebraska took home a 14-6 win. Notre Dame finished 1922 8-1-1. For Glen's 3 years with the Irish, they were 27-2-1. Judge was hampered by injuries much of his Notre Dame career, but led by example, and the men and coaches held him in high honor for his World War I service and for never quitting on his football dreams through all barriers. Judge went into the new pro game and played end on 2 different professional teams and worked as a lawyer during this time in Syracuse. He was drawn back into the college game to be assistant coach at Michigan State, and then he met up with cousin Earl Walsh again, and they went to Fordham to be assistant coaches. Judge coached the linemen and the legendary 7 blocks of granite, and one of the blocks was Vince Lombardi of the Green Bay Packers and pro football fame. Coach Rockne was flying in a mail plane and it crashed in a field in Kansas. Knute's record at Notre Dame was 105, 12, and 5 for a winning percentage of .898, which will probably never be broken. In 1938, Molly died in Ames, and all the lads were pallbearers. She reared great, well-rounded, and devout young men and women who made positive differences in their worlds. Glen married Grace Elizabeth Brennan in 1940, and they had 2 sons, Michael and William. Glen retired as a lawyer with the Veterans Administration and died in 1976. Glen, Judge Carberry, and the great Carberry family will not be forgotten. Lizzie Carberry, Molly and J.H.'s oldest daughter, married James Aquinas O'Brien, and their grandson Joe played for the Colorado Buffaloes as a tackle and defensive end, and her great-grandson Colin plays, as of this writing, for the Wyoming Cowboys.